Welcome. So I am joined by Eleanor Manley. Eleanor, thanks for joining.
Thank you for having me. Thanks so much.
And you are the founder of Metta-Space, which is a platform that is looking to tackle the considerable issue of sexual harassment in the workplace and trying to, I guess, mend behaviours. How did you get into starting this?
So I'm fresh out of a master's in data science, and unfortunately, we had quite a bad case in our class, and I realized then from speaking to the women of the class and actually also speaking to the men that this was it was a huge problem. So that's when we started collecting our own data about it, and from our data, we found that 60% of women experience sexual harassment and 33% of men have, which is actually larger than people suspect. They think that it's an issue that doesn't affect men, but it does. And out of all this, less than 10% reported it. So you can't solve an issue if it's being hidden. And that's why we're really pushing this tech focus and this data-driven approach to actually encourage people to report, but also prevent sexual harassment from occurring in the first place.
Okay, so your strapline for Metta-Space would be as the solution. How would you explain that?
Yeah, so we're an application, so a B2B application, in which an employee will have access to our app and can report the who, what, where, and whens of the sexual harassment case. And they can also have access to support and information about sexual harassment. On the other end, and that's what we're currently developing at the moment, is a natural language processing algorithm to detect sexual harassment in real time. So what we realize is that because there's so few people reporting it, there's not that much data about it. And all of the current solutions on the market are based more on ideas. So, ourselves, just the reporting app, and that there exists other fantastic reporting apps as well. But it's just based on what we perceive to be the best solution. But as the tech industry knows very well, if we're not collecting data, we can't create the best solutions for it. So that's why we're pushing this really tech approach. And what we hope to do with the natural language processing algorithm is to actually plug into workplace communications and flag up any communications that may be perceived as sexual harassment, and ask the receiver then, with a little pop-up message saying, oh, does this message make you feel uncomfortable? If they say yes, then it would redirect them to, would you like to report? And then they can submit a report. And if they say no, then the algorithm learns because obviously workplace banter and workplace communications also occurs very naturally. So we don't want to assume that sexual harassment has occurred just from, a specific sentence.
Yeah, this is fascinating because when you lean into the data-led approach to sort of define something, I guess where those boundaries end up lying will be so nuanced. So to give a kind of feel for the landscape, I mean, how would one typically define sexual harassment as it exists in the workplace today, do you think?
Yeah, that's a really good question, because when we started all of this, we were looking at definitions, and there were these long legal definitions that we just didn't make sense to us. So we came up with our own definition, and we define sexual harassment as any act perceived as having sexual intent that makes you feel uncomfortable. In other words, if it feels wrong to you, then it is wrong because your perception of the situation is important. And from that point forward, I mentioned earlier that from our own surveys and data collection, we found that 60% of women and 33% of men had experienced sexual harassment. But that's just asking them the question, have you been sexually harassed? If, on the contrary, you give them a list of, has someone looked at you inappropriately and it made you feel or touched you inappropriately, that number jumps from 60% for women to 99.9%, and for men from 30% to 60%. So that's why not only a broad definition is important to kind of encapsulate the perception, but it's also important that we actually give specific examples so that individuals can visualize what sexual harassment actually looks like and then are able to recognize it.
That's interesting, because then you're right. It becomes a categorization exercise, which is to self-categorize rather than subjectively try and set a standard for yourself based on, the double blind exercise of what you think other people think sexual harassment is. You just simply answer criteria. And then within that bounding box that you're creating, have you been able to sort of ascertain a natural hierarchy of urgency or priority or harassment, basically?
Yeah. So this is when the legal sphere comes in. And again, I want to push that, in most solutions today, it's more case by case than actually a categorization. But that's something that we want to change as well, because we do believe that, the better that we can categorize it, especially for an algorithm, the better we can actually understand its solution. But what tends to happen is anything that's physical, it's very black and white. If you're touched at work, that makes you feel uncomfortable. People are more likely to report it because it's like, oh, there was that contact. If on the contrary, it was just every day I walk into work and someone is looking me up and down, people don't really categorize that as sexual harassment, even though it is, because then you're sat at work feeling uncomfortable for the rest of the day. So, what we're trying to do is define the gray area, because the gray area is definitely the area in which we see the most frequent sexual harassment occurring, be it, just looks or certain language being used. And that's the one that's least reported. So that's definitely from a personal perspective and from Metta-Space's perspective, what we're really interested in tackling.
And do you look into sort of the anecdotal data around the employee, such as the effect of demoralization that may be caused by harassment?
Definitely. This is such an important point, because what we're seeing is that not only from an ethical perspective is this awful for an individual to go through, but from a financial perspective of the employer, and I think this is a number by Deloitte released, that $6 million are lost every year per Fortune 500 company linked directly to sexual harassment. This is if you went to any company and said, we can help you save $6 million a year, they would say, yes, tell us. And it's like, get rid of sexual harassment in your workplace. So, there's real repercussions, and this is linked to productivity. It's linked to employee turnover, and it's linked to absenteeism. And when we've been conducting our research, what we're finding is that HR departments do have the data on, how frequently someone turns up to work or their productivity level, but they're not linking that back to possible cases of sexual harassment. So that's something that we also want is to push for, is for companies to actually make that link, and that can be done quite simply with just some basic data insights from our application.
So to get an idea of the process, I don't work in a big company at all. We think we're like 10 people, so you're all in one room, so nothing escapes anybody's view. That's not to say that somebody may not have been made to feel uncomfortable at some point in time. You never know, right? Because you're not in their heads. But I think largely speaking, we don't have the same problems that these corporates have. But what happens in a typical corporate? And as you say, most is going underreported. But then what is the escalation process that happens at the moment within these companies, and why are they getting it so wrong potentially?
So there's two conventional channels. The first one is to go to HR. In my opinion, this is wrong, because if the sexual harassment is being perpetrated by someone within HR, then that becomes, a conversation that someone isn't going to be willing to have. And, just as well, HR aren't psychologists. They're not specialized in dealing with, cases like sexual harassment. They deal with redundancies and paychecks. It's a lot to put on them to also deal with sexual harassment. And then on the other hand, you have just going directly to your line manager. So in the hierarchy, going to the person above you. Again, what's difficult with that is, firstly, who the perpetrator might be. And it sort of puts your job on the line because it's the person above you. So it's a really difficult situation. And there are many reasons that people don't report. But one of the main one is that firstly, they think that they won't be believed. And this is especially the case for that kind of gray area that we've been talking about of sexual harassment, which it seems like minute things, but it accumulates over time and really affects the person. And also that there'll be some sort of, if they report something negative would happen. So, for example, everyone at work will go against them. To give you kind of perspective on this, a woman is more likely to resign from her job than to report a case of sexual harassment. So clearly these conventional channels aren't working, and that's why it's so important that we come with a better reporting system to make people feel empowered to actually speak up.
Well, so I guess I'm looking at it in the same way you are at the moment while having this discussion, which is to eyeball the data on this. And what's interesting is maybe with subtle cues, if a certain employee is getting flagged by multiple employees for what are called like sort of subperceptive, let's say for the sake of argument, offences, whereby it's only I can see that I feel that they're doing this, but then you're starting to get 5 to 10 people in the company also complaining about that one employee. You start to build up, I guess, a body of evidence with which you can start to build a case. Because I think that seems to be the problem at the moment, is you have legal recourse, you have the internal company politics, and then you have the body of evidence you're able to supply, which I guess most of it has to be self-reported at the moment. Is that right?
Yeah, definitely. And it's difficult for an individual to keep track every day of these behaviors. So, for example, how do you prove like someone was just looking at you inappropriately? It's very difficult to do so. And that's why also bystander intervention is so important. Is for us, we also not only want to encourage people experiencing sexual harassment directly to report, but also any witnesses. Because usually you can tell when someone feels uncomfortable, and maybe that person doesn't feel comfortable reporting, but because it's anonymous, you also can report and show and be their evidence backing it up.
And I don't mean to sort of delve into this any more than you wish to share, but in terms of your own personal experiences that I assume have coloured your desire to solve this problem, I mean, are there any you'd be willing to sort of share from your archives, I guess?
Yeah, I mean, from my case, I'm English but grew up in France, and my co-founder is German but grew up in Italy. So we definitely have that real culture clash about what is acceptable. So in France, from the age of 14, you're very aware of being a sexualized being, but I would never have interpreted it as sexual harassment at 14.
Yeah.
But from that point onwards, I think it was just you just have continuous small cases. Fortunately, I myself am someone who I feel very comfortable, and I always have, about speaking up when someone's made me feel uncomfortable. But this year, when when we first started talking about why it started, because of this case at university, what I realized is that there's so many people who don't, because they might be a little bit more shy or more introverted, and it's not fair to have them be quiet about it just because of their personalities is just not to speak about things, and they're being made feel really uncomfortable. And what we saw here was the person who was perpetrating the sexual harassment, it was affecting half the women of the class.
Wow.
And so we also see, and I think this is, again, I want to collect more data to back up this, but this is my assumption, is that a perpetrator repeatedly behaves in such a way. It's not 10 men or 10 women will do one act of sexual harassment. Rather, it's one individual who repeatedly affects a lot of people. So if we're able to nip that behavior in the bud, and we also want to talk about, I think it's important we talk about like the reasons that people perpetrate sexual harassment. Sometimes it might be unintentional. As I said, in terms of culture, for me, I've definitely seen those two sides where I know it's unintentional. It's just what you've grown up with. So if we're able to nip it in the bud and stop this one person from perpetrating and for making a lot of people feel uncomfortable, then a workplace becomes a lot better very quickly, because it's actually you're only dealing with one person. So that's really also what we're trying to push, is to understand why someone is perpetrating sexual harassment.
Yeah, very, very interesting. Really interesting indeed, because I mean, so I'll open up a case that I guess for the longest amount of time I didn't think was appropriate to me, or I just think, well, I'm a guy. So 10 years ago, I used to be in the modeling industry, and I'd end up on these shoots with photographers and stuff like this, and I remember one time I was in a room full of, men who like men, and I was getting a lot of heckling, and at the time I was only 20 years old, and you just pass it off as you think, well, nothing of it. It's just them passing comment, etc. But actually, if I think about it now, I was 20, and it made me feel uncomfortable. I didn't feel that I could speak out, and yes, no, nothing happened. But at the same time, that environment was pretty unenjoyable. And actually, I would then go on to comment further about the fashion industry in general and say, I think there's a huge abuse of power that goes on with the sort of Terry Richardsons and some of the other photographers that get named as abusing these positions. But it was just very interesting. And it wasn't until I'd really sort of started prepping for this discussion, I thought, you know what, that was unenjoyable, and nothing about that experience is a positive. And it allows me, I think, in my life to relate to the objectifying that goes on towards women, because essentially when I was doing modeling, you are purely objectified. The only thing that exists about you or value you have is to be objectified. So I have some context for it, but I don't think to the degree that of the constant nature that I think can happen to some women. You touched on an interesting point about maybe, would you try and combine this maybe with like assertiveness training, whereby in conjunction with stopping the problem creators, there's also this sort of support side of allowing people to stick up for themselves as well?
Yeah, definitely. This is sort of what we're working towards, because I think that the reporting is a reactive approach. And, as we've been speaking, I think the prevention is the most important. So, in the grand scheme or the grand plan that we want to do is we want to have the reporting and also have the support. So have virtual psychologists for people to contact whilst they're reporting, because, perhaps they don't even want something to happen. They just need someone to speak to. So we want that side, and also perhaps for perpetrators to speak, to understand why their behavior is wrong and why this made someone feel uncomfortable, and how they can actually, become better and keep on improving. But then on the other side, before all of that, training is so important. And to be like, for example, if I, an English person, go into a French company and they're always doing la bise and they're a bit more touchy, and I'm like, it just doesn't feel good for me. You can then, in the training, I'm told you can speak up about this. If there's anything that makes you feel uncomfortable, even if it seems a bit silly to you and just you don't want someone to give you la bise, that you can say, oh no, this is not right. And I think it's just part of a process of understanding respect and setting boundaries between people. And it seems, oh, well, of course, but actually it's not the case in a lot of companies. You're kind of thrown in, and especially, you have experience in the fashion industry. My experience was in, in more technical. And we definitely saw this situation where people weren't allowed to set their boundaries, and they weren't then allowed to be like, okay, my boundaries have been breached. So that's definitely the training part that we'd want to include. But again, this is kind of in the grand scheme of things. Right now, we're just really concentrating on the tech and the reporting system.
Yeah, of course. Well, and you can only learn from the reporting system because that's sort of the body of evidence. But you touched on a really interesting point as well earlier, which I'd meant to circle back around to, which is that what creates this behavior, and it's so confusing because, as you say, some of it is kind of just cultural nuance, not adapting to new circumstances. I don't think is an excuse beyond reading the company handbook and saying, look, sorry, don't kiss employees on the cheek, or just don't touch them. There's nothing to be gained from it. And whether we set a very sort of rigid professional environment where it's like, look, the de facto setting is this. If you want to cross that line, you're immediately putting yourself into territory. And you as an adult should know this. But the creation of this sort of, let's say, for the sake of argument, the 10% who create 80% of the problems. What's your view on what creates that? I have my views, and I'll share those afterwards. But what do you think?
I think first, it's a very difficult question to answer, because this is definitely from my own experience rather than actually based on like a large amount of data. But I definitely think that, well, we're talking specifically today about sexual harassment. But what you'll see is that if someone is a harasser, it doesn't matter what type of harassment that they'll perpetrate. It's sort of like anything goes. So what we're realizing as well at the moment is sexual harassment can also have racial connotations. So, for example, it could be sexualizing someone of a specific race, and it just basically
sort of like
means
a fetishization, or
yeah, but it basically means that if someone is a harasser, they don't really have any kind of categories of, oh, I'm just going to be a sexual harasser. It's usually like if they're someone who wants to intimidate and make other people feel bad, they'll do it in any way that they see fit. And that's why it's also really important whilst we're developing this technology is to take all of that into account, because me as a white woman, I will experience sexual harassment very differently from a black woman. And that's all things that need to be taken into account. But going back to your question about specifically, what's perpetrating it, I do think that it has a lot to do with power and the need to feel like respected, or the willingness to prove yourself. I think that for men, for example, if you're perpetrating sexual harassment, it might be to kind of prove yourself as a man, to say, oh, look, I'm sexualizing these women, it makes me more manly. Which and when we talk about sexual harassment and talking about the umbrella term, what we see because men experience sexual harassment from other men as well, you'll see a lot of comments, for example, about them being that they're not manly enough or they're not man enough. That's also a type of sexual harassment in its sort of broad term, because it's making an individual feel uncomfortable about their gender and about their sex. So this is all things that it's definitely a power play. But again, maybe in like 6 months' time, I can answer this question very specifically and show you the data and be like, oh, actually, I found this is this. But for the time being, from my own experience, it definitely seems to be a bit of a power play.
Yeah, I think the word power would come up. So I'll hazard a guess, and of course this is completely subjective, but I think there is a problem that occurs somewhere in teenagehood, and whether it's somebody not being validated and then subsequently not having any power, feeling disempowered, and then getting to a position of power where there's almost this score that they feel they need to settle, or this subjugation they need to sort of carry out. But it's very interesting, because I think that's my problem with it, is I think by the time you're dealing with it 10 years into the workplace, I think you can try and help that person. Of course, they've got no choice but to amend their behavior. But I ultimately think that in a way they start going off track somewhere in their teenage years, and then this behavior starts to normalize. And that is the crazy thing about it, right? Is when somebody starts to normalize behavior that is, they're not even empathizing with other people. So it's not about their own gratification or power. It's like you're actually making people unhappy. And if you can't acknowledge that, you're not a team player. And if you're not a team player, then ultimately you shouldn't be part of a team. With regards to what might be a prescriptive way of dealing with this, I mean, would we give people like this, do they get a traffic lighting system whereby the offence is sort of categorized, and then, maybe they're given hours with a psychotherapist, and then they're given another warning, and they're given chances, or where do you sort of see the maybe effective outcomes to try and change this?
What's really interesting about this question is we've conducted a lot of focus groups about it, and we divided the groups into men and women. And the biggest focus group that we conducted were with men, actually. And the difference, we asked exactly this question, what should happen to a perpetrator? What should we do to make it right? And the difference between what women responded, what men responded, was so stark. Men straight away were like, it's a legal issue. If they're committing sexual harassment, they should be, punished to, the most that they possibly can be it from being reprimanded from their work, to being sacked, to actually creating a court case against them. Women, on the other hand, who, are the individuals who experience it the most, were a lot more, I would say, it would depend case on case. So, for example, a lot of people don't report when there's a zero tolerance policy at a workplace because, for example, the gray area that we talked about, it makes someone feel uncomfortable, but they don't necessarily want the other person to get sacked. They just want the behavior to stop. So you might think, okay, a zero tolerance approach is actually the right way to go, but it also sends a message to someone reporting, okay, if I report, this will have grave consequences, and I actually don't want that. I just want someone to stop the behavior. So with the women, we saw a lot of just like, oh, I just want them to be sat down, have a conversation, but ultimately the behavior to stop, however that would occur. Whilst the men that we interviewed, it was far more, oh, actually there should be a punishment in place. I personally think that, again, there should be a case on case basis. At MettaSpace, we're not at all pushing towards any solution. It's up to the company to decide what they think is best. But we definitely do want to let them know about the data that we have collected and, why a zero tolerance approach might seem like you're putting on a very strong front against sexual harassment, but actually the consequences of that might be negative because people are less likely to report.
I think I agree with the idea that if the punishment is harsh and somebody loses their job, you don't necessarily make a better person out of that individual. And quite frankly, if they fall off the radar, maybe the behaviours will start getting worse. I suspect with men, and this is probably projecting my own beliefs on this, but I think maybe the binary viewpoint is that you believe that somebody is basically, let's use the terminology that might be thrown out, you think they're a pervert. And actually, if they're a pervert, they've gone down that road. They've chosen that outcome and they've become that person, which I think I personally see in men as a weakness, right? Like being part of, I think there's two ways men sort of project sexuality, is that it could be seen as a sign of dominance and strength. And I also think it actually can be seen as a sign of great weakness, which is that you have compulsions that you are unable to control to the point where you're bringing them into the workplace, a professional environment, and you still can't control. Do you know what I mean? It's like you've lost control and something is controlling you. And I don't know what the dynamics there are way more complicated than I'd care to be able to offer a viewpoint on. But I think maybe with men's head, they sort of say, well, you've not overcome that. And it's the case it reminds me of is like when you go to clubs and there's some people who are there for a good time and there's some men who just go around grabbing, harassing, and you just think this is an extraordinary behavior to carry out. Like it's just so self-serving and strange, and it ruined. You can see with the girls who get approached by these guys, they tighten up, it ruins their evening time and time again. And you just think, what? And when I look at men like that, I just think there's something different about you. You just don't have that self-respect as well as respect for others.
I think there's definitely the question of, so firstly, your point about the workplace. What we're pushing is a sort of very black and white approach. It's like there's no place for sexualized behavior at work. If you choose to engage in flirtatious behavior, that's your choice. But then again, this is a workplace. So that makes it easier in terms of MettaSpace to be like, okay, if there's an instance of sexualized behavior, you ask if both parties are consenting. If they weren't, then, that's when we can sort of come in. But giving the example of a club, I think you're right. It's very bizarre to think that people are just they're very comfortable with doing it as well. And I think that this is important where, you're recognizing that behavior. So next time that you see someone in the club, be like, what are you doing? Stop. Because I know that, from being on the receiving end, but also from telling someone to stop as well, when women are out, they don't necessarily want to be having a conversation about gender equality and how this is affecting them, negatively. They just want to have a drink with their friends. So I think it's important that men also, because for us to be truly equal, we need men and women to come together and actually work together. And you need men speaking up about these instances of sexual harassment, be it at the workplace or on a more casual night out.
And I think you're right. This is probably where the sort of overlap of the Venn diagram comes, is that as a man, I think, yes, exactly to your point, when we used to go out with groups of mates and guys would come in, you sort of grab you'd sort of make eye signals to your girlmate of like, are you okay with this? And when they're like, no, you grab them in, you're like, hey, come dance with me. And you sort of reposition everybody over here, and you make like a human shield, or you pretend it's, and it is exhausting. It's exhausting. You get a perspective where you go, this is happening, every 10 minutes. This is ridiculous. But you're right. Part of the conversation you just touched on there is you do need the support and the intervention of men who see and identify it as a problem, and not just for them, just a problem at large, because the same thing holds true. Look, women physically are inherently vulnerable to most men, the same way that I would be if a man was 6'6" and weighed 18 stone. There's just you just have a physical attribute that's not in your favor, and so at some point you do need that physical presence of somebody saying, back off. The problem then you get the escalation dynamics that can take place between two men, especially when there's a female audience, right? Which is that, one may then see to try and prove a point. So I mean, these are sort of extrapolating examples beyond the workplace. You wouldn't expect that to happen, but it's such a confusing issue. So in terms of MettaSpace and where you are at today, you're collecting data and you're doing focus groups. I mean, are you piloting with anybody, or what's the timeline for piloting with some companies to start working on this?
Yeah, so our MVP is ready. So the focus group, so we were doing that during our time at university, and obviously we're continuously collecting more data. But as I told you just before this started recording, I started to web scrape Reddit and other sources to actually get more reports of sexual harassment, because I'm aware that until we start having a lot of customers, the data is not really going to be statistically relevant, because we'll have a couple of hundred rather than a couple of tens of thousands. So what we're doing at the moment is the MVP is ready. We're testing it out on 2 pilot projects, one with our partners in Rotterdam, and another one with our partners in India. And what we're trying to look here is, firstly, will people use a reporting system? Does it actually encourage people to report more, or does it actually encourage people to report less? Our assumption is that they would report more. And from that point forward, actually, we're asking them the demographics and the individuals who are most at stake. Obviously, because we're only dealing with 2 companies in the pilot project, that's already decided for us, those variables. But that's why we're also including the data that I'm web scraping into the natural language processing algorithm at the end, is so that we can actually compare and contrast and see, okay, so this is the data I've collected from online presences, and this is the data that we're collecting from our customers. Are there any patterns, or rather are they completely contrasting, and we have to rethink our solution completely?
You currently operate with a system where there is, I guess, like a casual reporting process, and then there's like a sort of emergency reporting process, which is an SOS button. And what, dare I ask, what the kind of use cases might be for that to be used?
So that's also something that we're testing out, but it's really in its initial phases. But this would be in a case where perhaps someone needs to go to the police, or sexual harassment at the end of the day is a legal issue, but because of this gray area, people just want to report it so the behavior stops. But there are cases where it might have escalated to such a degree that there might need to be a court case. So we also want to provide individuals with the ability to actually contact the police through our application in whichever country that they're residing. And we can also provide the police with the reports that they've made on our application, because psychologically, when you're reporting, it's difficult to keep on repeating the same answer again and again and again, and to be seen to be put on trial and not be believed. So that's why also we really want to be transparent about the data that we're collecting from, the ethical tech point of view, but also from a evidence perspective, so that anyone can have a time-stamped evidence that they can give to whomever that they might need about what they've experienced or what they've witnessed.
And do you imagine that you'll build up a data set or volume of data sets whereby you can almost start highlighting, I don't want to call it a hall of shame of companies, but I mean, clearly, if you work with enough different enterprise clients, eventually you may start spotting toxic cultures within certain organizations, which would be interesting because you've got this sort of meta layer, which is, men and women in general, and the percentages you'd expect within, let's say, a country. And then you might have the differences between organizations where they have a particularly entitled culture or who knows, or maybe even a really bad exec and C-suite who are not coming down on this stuff.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, what's important to note here is that it's completely anonymous. So obviously, when we're collecting data from a company, there's no. My co-founder's cybersecurity expert. She can explain this, at far greater extent than I can. But there's no way that the data could be leaked or hacked from being like, oh, this company experiences this level of sexual harassment. But again, we also want to change this perception of, oh, having sexual harassment is bad. But what's happening currently is that companies are saying we don't have any cases of sexual harassment, rather than saying we have cases of sexual harassment and we're dealing with it. So I think that if we have companies that have loads of cases of sexual harassment coming forward, I don't think that reflects badly on them necessarily, because they're creating a reporting system that they're putting in place to improve on this. And that's all that you can do, is keep on improving and saying, okay, what are the problems? And that's why, if we are employed by a company that has a lot of cases, that's for us is better, because it's showing that they want to change their culture, while in contrast, a company that doesn't have a reporting system in place isn't protecting their employees at all. So I think, it's important that when we talk about data collection, it's not seen as a negative, getting more reports. Actually, it's seen as, it's actually neutral. It is what it is.
But it's a bit like COVID testing, right? It's like the only reason why more COVID cases are coming to light is also because there's more testing, which you can't.
No, and also about, in terms of demographics, that's also what we want to be collecting is the more companies that work with us, the better we can understand sexual harassment. And a new law is coming in for the EU called the EU Directive 1937-2019, and it states that all companies have to have an anonymous whistleblowing system. So a company like ours will become a necessity for companies to be legally compliant with this directive.
Now, I'm going to get your opinion on this, and this is not to sort of try and bend the lens on how serious an issue is this, but what do you think is the current status of manipulated reporting? Is that a thing? Do you get cases of some women placing cases that are not valid?
That's a really important question. It's one that we get a lot about false accusations, because it's seen as it's easier to say that a case is false than to actually kind of deal with a real case. But in terms of data, we haven't got enough data to prove that there's any statistical relevance of false accusations currently. The only data that we do have, and that is somewhat comparable, but one could argue that isn't, is that rape cases, about 2% of rape cases are said to be false when they're reported, which is such a small number. So in terms of sexual harassment cases that we're looking at, a lot of times women and men have to prove that it's happening, and it's assumed that it's false before. But we have this perception, oh, it's because they want a better job or they're disgruntled. But no, if emotionally the toil that it takes to actually report something like that is huge. So for the time being, my opinion, and this is until we start collecting the data on our own reports, is that there's no evidence that sexual harassment or false sexual harassment cases exist to an extent that could be quantified. Which means that, the solution that we're providing is trying to encourage people to report. Nonetheless, when we talk about false accusations, this is also why we want to be really evidence-based and data-driven, is to if someone is submitting a report, the who, what, where, and when, that then, they provide that, and that's going to be investigated by the company. If they have to have something there to kind of build up their case, and that's what we're trying to encourage. So if it is a false accusation, it's going to be seen quite rapidly. And the new EU directive that I just mentioned, it protects whistleblowers, but if someone also comes in with a false report, they can be penalized under this law. So it's not just, if you're submitting a false report, it's bad for your company, but it's also on an EU level, you're also going to be penalized. So, obviously false reports, it diminishes the value and it makes people scared to report. So that's why it's so frustrating, because you see many people thinking, I'm not going to be believed, when statistically speaking, there's currently no evidence of false reports coming into reporting systems that we're currently aware of.
Do we allow further room for technology to corroborate stories, whether that be, let's say, an open plan office has security cameras on it? I mean, do we need stuff like this to then shore up the body of evidence, or do you think that's too much of an invasion into kind of a workplace culture?
I mean, what we're trying to do at the moment is we provide people with the possibility to include screenshots. And if, it's up to the company to decide that. It's not up to us. We would never come in and say, we want to look at your footage. How the sexual harassment case is dealt with is up to the company. But I would encourage people to look at as much evidence as they can when looking into a sexual harassment case, because you'll find that it will give you an overview of your culture that you might never have seen before. And I also think that it's important, when we're talking about this natural language processing that I'm really interested in, and the machine learning that comes out of it, all companies have all of their workplace communications on their servers, be it Slack, be it G Suite, whatever it is. You're going to find cases, or perhaps, especially in times of COVID, sexual harassment has not stopped. It's actually become increasingly digitalized. And this, although is awful for the person experiencing it, because it means that there's no safe space between home and work anymore, because their home is their work, it also provides us with an opportunity to actually assess sexual harassment in its written form, which is what NLP is. And if we can do that and actually plug into workplace communications, and as I mentioned, have this plugin which would detect any instances that may be seen as sexual harassment, it provides a great opportunity for a company as well to kind of take a step back and be like, this issue is being dealt with silently whilst all of our communications are being made, and will be preventative in its approach, not only because it could detect anything, but if someone knew that they had an algorithm that could detect any instances of sexual harassment, I think you would think twice about sending a message that might be a bit risky. And that in itself is preventative of sexual harassment at work. And
who are the most at risk? My guess is that young females just joining the workplace are probably the most at risk of harassment. Is that right?
Well, it's an interesting question, because I think it's a question that today women are more likely to recognize sexual harassment than older generations. I was speaking to the women in my family, and they're all very very conscious about what sexual harassment is. When we did our big data collection, we found that between the age of 20 and 35, women had experienced the most sexual harassment, but men had as well. And so we're seeing that our generation is really able to recognize sexual harassment and speak up about it, because they were also the ones that had reported it the most frequently. So it's difficult to say from just what we've collected to say, this group is more at risk than another. But we're definitely seeing a movement of people recognizing sexual harassment more and reporting it more in, under 35s.
Interesting. And with regards to the workplace chats. Will there be any that you won't be able to integrate with, or that you can't get your systems embedded into, or do you, as you say, you just go onto the company's servers and can get hold of the chats that way?
Yeah, I would love for us to go into detail about this in the future, but right now we haven't done any of our integration, so that's definitely a conversation for the future. But I hope, there's a lot of companies that do productivity, that concentrate specifically on productivity, and they plug into Slack and G Suite. So if they're able to do that, then I don't see why MettaSpace wouldn't be able to do it either.
Okay, and to extend, I guess, a vision for maybe the future, how does one, I guess, tackle stuff? Do we have a problem? Do open plan offices, have they been shown to increase this? Should some people be kind of kept in different parts of the office? Should you reshuffle people, teams, dynamics? Should you stop employees from touching each other? Do you have a viewpoint on workplace relationships? Should they be absolute? I assume they probably are outlawed. I don't know, but should they just be an absolute no categorically? And what happens if somebody does fancy a co-worker, and where does that go? I know you sort of said there's space outside of work, but do you have a viewpoint on, I guess, all of these questions of what the workplace could look like if amended in 5 years' time, and where we'd still have room to still have humanity without being abuse?
Yeah, this is definitely my own personal opinion. I definitely think it's so important to foster relationships in the workplace. We don't want people to be scared to speak to someone of the opposite sex because they think that, oh no, it might be crossing the lines. That's definitely something that should not be encouraged. It's just about encouraging people to know their own boundaries, to set them, and to know when they've been breached. And in terms of what that could look like, I have no idea, and I hope that perhaps with the data that we collect with MettaSpace, and we definitely want to push open, we're definitely open source and want to push research into this matter. So whatever data we're collecting, all anonymous, obviously, we want to share so that everyone can understand, our algorithm, what we're doing, because we want to be part of this movement of for business for good and ethical tech, and you can't do that by being secretive about how you've coded something or the data that you're collecting. So I think that research is definitely the way forward, and we'll be releasing papers about sexual harassment in the year to come about what we found and our recommendations of what companies can do. And hopefully, and we'll see that our recommendations will get better and better, and they'll get more and more specific as time goes on, because we'll be collecting more data about this. But yeah, I definitely think it's just to sort of wrap up this point, it's so important that we continue to foster relationships at the workplace, and that people feel safe within that. And that should be done through, a multi-dimensional approach from, training, support, and reporting, which is what we're really pushing at MettaSpace.
Well, interesting enough, you might become the sandbox environment for what a good workplace could look like as you scale, because assuming from the ground up, you will build your company with an awareness of how this looks and how to stamp it out within your own organization.
No, yeah, we're just hoping, we're starting to hire now. So it's definitely, my co-founder and I, we've known each other for a long time, so it's very easy for us to work together, and that the communication is very, very open. So we're definitely trying to instill the correct values and make sure that people feel safe to speak up, oh, actually, Alan, I don't like the stroke that you made, or whatever that might be within our own culture.
Well, that actually touched on my last point of anybody who's excited about what you're doing. What positions are open at the moment, and how can they get in touch with you if they want to help?
Yeah, well, so we have a fantastic network of ambassadors. So they're individuals who just want to be part of the movement. So be it from networkers who are individuals who speak out about sexual harassment and help us to get the word out about MettaSpace, to specific researchers and developers. As I mentioned earlier, we're really pushing for the R&D department to make sure that everything is open source, so that everyone can build on our technology, and from business development. But specifically in open positions, we're looking to hire, a full-time developer to join our team, since our MVP was outsourced to a development company.
Great. Well, thank you so much for coming on. I mean, I know we haven't solved the issue just in the sort of 50 minutes we've been speaking, but it's certainly interesting to get the dialogue going. So I really appreciate your time and your mission. And look forward to seeing some of the papers, which I'll happily distribute to people to read as they keep getting published.
Yeah, thank you so much. It's been lovely to speak to you.